So I've been looking forward to doing this video for a while. This video is about Dan McClellan narrowly and internet and particularly video scholarship more broadly. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok scholarship, scholars who are using these platforms to get their content out there, of which Dan is a noteworthy example. And I've been wanting to do this video for a while because this channel is all about faith and skepticism and deconstruction and the intersection of what we believe and what we can study and faith and doubt and how all that fits together. And for many people, at least in my experience, Dan's a pretty prominent voice in that conversation, or in their conversations at least. So wanted to do this video, and then on Sunday I actually name dropped Dan in my sermon and got a well-deserved email from someone asking me to elaborate on that a little bit more. And so I'm happy to do that and to bring a couple of these threads together. So we're going to start by talking about scholarship a little bit more broadly, because in his videos, Dan introduces himself as a
scholar of the Bible and religion.
So what does that actually mean? I don't know what comes to everybody's minds when they think about scholarship or what a scholar is, but in my experience, people tend to think of a scholar as someone who knows a lot, and because they know a lot, they get to speak with authority on topics, particularly those topics that are germane to the areas of their expertise. Now, a little bit of what I bring to this: I am the grandson of a PhD. I have friends with PhDs. I'm a grad student right now studying under people with PhDs and reading and interacting with scholarly material on a regular basis. And I'm a working pastor, which means that I'm interacting with scholarship, with published scholarship on a weekly basis as I prepare for my sermons, whether that's commentaries or monographs or journal articles and so on. And in my experience, how much a particular scholar knows, how much they know, it varies quite a bit from one scholar to the next. And that really fits given what goes on when someone gets a PhD, for example. So depending on where they got their PhD and under whom they studied, a PhD can be an incredibly focused learning experience. And again, depending how far into a niche someone gets, it's very possible for a scholar to be someone who knows a whole lot about very little. And by very little, I mean it's a very narrow spectrum about which they know a whole lot. And it's possible for that to be true, and in the meantime, for them to not know more than the average person about basically everything else outside of their very narrow spectrum of expertise. And that's actually by design. That's one of the features of a PhD. There's a graphic that was passed around years ago that helped PhD students understand what was actually going on, and how, if you think of human knowledge as this big circle, and that in one little part of the circle, they were moving it out just a little bit, just giving a tiny little bulge in that circle of human knowledge, as they focused in on a very specific topic to advance that just a little bit. And that's one of the things when a student comes to write a PhD is that their thesis often gets more and more and more refined as that process goes on, so that they start off thinking they're going to be saying a whole bunch of things about a whole bunch of things, and actually they end up saying one very specific thing, because that's just the nature of the level of intensity and focus that you apply and have to apply at that level of scholarly work. And often that level of focus is going to continue in various ways into their scholarly career. So how much a scholar knows outside of their particular niche or niches is often up to them. And what should apply outside of their particular niche, outside of their particular field or fields of expertise, is not that they are expected to know everything about everything, but rather that through that process of being trained as a scholar, they know how to know things. They know how to know things. Scholarship has given them and taught them a particular set of skills. So they know how to do research, which is really key. And they have a set of tools and processes for how to study things and how to come to reliable conclusions about things. And so here, by when I talk about these particular set of skills and so on, I'm talking about things like citing sources, only making statements about things that you can substantiate with evidence, not talking about someone's motivations or someone's capacity when you actually have no data to support that. You talk about their conclusions and their arguments and the things that you actually can substantiate with hard data. You interact with contradictory positions to make sure that you are surveying the whole scope of data instead of cherry picking your data to arrive at a particular conclusion. So these are some examples of some of the things that scholars learn and are trained in. And when they apply those skills to their particular area of expertise, or maybe just even the very narrow topic that they explore and do research in for their PhD, which again is going to also include a fair bit of breadth. So I don't want to make it all out to sound one-sided here. There is both depth and breadth. And when they come to when they apply those skills and they come to conclusions that they can then say with some confidence, this is the conclusions I've reached. What's really important is that even let's say you have a PhD who is writing or talking about the topic on which they wrote their PhD. They don't get to speak as personal authorities with just this kind of personal knowledge, and they can just say whatever they want to say. The most respected PhDs, the most respected scholars, when they write or speak in their field, they don't just get to say whatever they want to say based on their personal authority. They continue to cite sources and references and support the things that they're saying with actual evidence. In other words, they're showing their work. That's one of the kind of cornerstones of scholarship, is you're showing your work so other people can see how you got to your conclusions and then be able to evaluate whether that was a legitimate conclusion based on the evidence and the data or not. And so the most respected scholars are going to draw reasonable and well-argued conclusions from documented data. That's what makes them respected, is that they do that. And that's really what makes a scholar a scholar. It's not about knowing everything. It's about the discipline of scholarship, the tools, the process, etc. And what makes a good scholar is that in the process of pursuing that knowledge and then going on to teach and so on, their sense of confidence in their conclusions is chastened. And they know that just because something makes sense to them intuitively doesn't mean that it's true, that they need to actually chase the data and see if there's evidence for that thing that might seem obvious but might actually not be. They know how much they don't know, and they use those tools of learning wherever they go. And if they're going to work in an area outside of their particular field of expertise, they're going to be still doing high quality research. They're going to hopefully be driven by curiosity and a desire for the truth as they carefully argue for conclusions in a responsible way. And that is why it's that set of tools, that set of disciplines, and combined with a curiosity about the way things are, that has made some of the scholars that I know and count as personal friends to be some of the most brilliant and wise and well-read people on planet Earth. But then there are others who would not match that description, to be polite here. I can think of one person in particular I knew a number of years back who knew how to work with the system, knew how to use the tools, ground out a PhD, but their reliability to speak to anything outside of the very, very narrow area that they had done their research in was very, very questionable. The set of tools and skills that they had used to do that project basically got left behind as soon as they were done. And they went on to become the kind of person who would just say whatever they wanted about all kinds of different things. And they assumed that the people who didn't understand how all of this worked would just take their word for it because, well, they're a scholar with a PhD. And we kind of see how this works in different areas. Like you can think about how almost every loony health idea out there has some medical doctor attached to it who's going to support it and put their name on a book. And so we understand that there's a lot more than the credential to making someone wise. And here's the thing. People are free to do that. There's no guild or club or officer that says, okay, you're a scholar now. You have to act and think and conduct yourself like a scholar everywhere you go, everything you say. There's no rules that says that they have to do that. But here's the thing. If they're not going to do that, they don't get to call it scholarship. So if they're going to set aside that set of tools and skills and just pronounce things about things without supporting it, for example, they can do that. But just because they're a scholar doesn't mean that them doing that is scholarship. Think of a gourmet chef who, is working at a Michelin star restaurant and comes home and pops a bag of microwave popcorn in the microwave. They're allowed to do that, but that is not gourmet cooking. And them being a Michelin chef does not make that bag of microwave popcorn anything more than a bag of microwave popcorn. Enter Dan McClellan. Dan McClellan introduces himself as a
scholar of the Bible and religion.
But frankly, much of what I have watched on his channel is simply not scholarship by definition. I've watched enough of his stuff, but just as I was preparing for this, I just went on and grabbed the most recent short that he had released, and I'm sure by the time you see this, there are others. But it was a short, and I'll link to it here. It draws on some material from his doctoral thesis about how
prior to the Babylonian exile, God's sovereignty on earth was understood to be limited to the land of Israel.
Dan goes on to list a bunch of verses that supposedly either give credibility to his view or maybe which his view is explaining. And it just needs to be said that what he's doing there in that video is not scholarship. He doesn't even point to the chapter and verse of these different passages, let alone does he interact with other views on how these passages might be interpreted and give reasons for why his interpretation of these passages is a more trustworthy interpretation. And what's really interesting is that this is the case right in his doctoral thesis. He basically does what he did in the video, and that's maybe a question to be answered another time of how that happens. Frankly, his comments in the video show little awareness. If it's there, it's not evident, of biblical theology, how biblical theology works, and the way that other theologians have traced the theme throughout Scripture of the people of God being blessed by God in the land which God chose for them, and how that very legitimate theme connects to the other biblical data about the supremacy of Yahweh over the other gods and how his power works in the other lands and other areas. He doesn't touch on anything in this video that would challenge his view. He doesn't talk about how 2 Kings 3, which is where the king of Moab offers his son as a human sacrifice, how that has an incredibly complicated history of interpretation. There's a lot that's been written about that. And it is not evident that the wrath that comes against Israel is the wrath of Chemosh, and that shows that
they are forced out because Chemosh is sovereign in the territory. Adonai lost home court advantage.
It is not evident that is the best interpretation. It's certainly not the only interpretation that scholarship has put forward, and there are many who would say that that's actually not the best. And I could give sources for this because I've was reading some of these things just even a few minutes ago. And so the point here is that in this video, Dan is not doing scholarship. Rather, if we were to compare the genre here, he is proof texting. So saying, here's a point and here's 3 Bible verses that back it up and I'm done. That's called proof texting. It's the kind of thing that preachers often do in sermons. And as a preacher, I say guilty as charged. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that works when you're working with people with whom you have a bit of a shared database and hermeneutic and so on. But that's what Dan is doing here. He's proof texting. He's operating more like a preacher to his audience than a scholar. And this honesty comes across more as like devotional material for the deconstructing than it does actual scholarship. And so Dan might be a trained chef, but that doesn't make a video like this anything more than microwave popcorn. And it's just not scholarship. And I could think of other videos when Dan talks about people just not being able to comprehend what the text of the Bible says, how it
just scorches by miles over the heads of everybody who thinks they have the definitive grasp on what the Hebrew Bible is talking about, and they just don't.
When he talks about...
Obviously, Josh is giving priority to right-wing authoritarian and social dominance orientation identity politics because that's what best serves the structuring of power and values and boundaries in a way that advances his interests. Because this is not a very thoughtful engagement with the text. This is not a very ethical engagement with the text. This is an engagement that is concerned with structuring power and with identity politics. And that's why Josh cannot actually engage what Representative Tallarico actually said, and instead has to gin up this straw man fallacy and attack that with all these presuppositions and these bad apologetics.
That's just not scholarship. That's not a scholarly way of interacting with other people's positions. That's stuff that would get lots of red marks on a first-year college paper. Now, I know that there are videos where Dan actually does show sources and will put lexicons up on the screen and so on. And there are videos where he does do real scholarship. So I'm not denying that. And I'm also not denying that he has done real scholarship to arrive at the conclusions that he shares in this video, just taking this most recent short, for example. But then the question becomes, if that has happened, why is it presented in that way? Because here's the thing. If someone was to just watch Dan's video about how Israel's God was limited in power outside of the land and just was to then see him mention those 3 verses, and then that person was just to go, oh, okay, I guess that's the way it is. Like that's shameful. That's not cool, because there's a whole lot more there than Dan is letting on. And anyone who is functioning as a scholar would not want you to agree with them for those kind of quick throwaway reasons. They would do what scholarship does, which is show you their work so you can see how they came to those conclusions, evaluate their conclusions over and against other conclusions, and then come to your own conclusion about whether their conclusion is a legitimate interpretation of all of the data or not. So there is a bit of a pattern here to the way that Dan interacts with material, the types of conclusions that he arrives at, the way that he shares them, and so on. And I don't want to sound patronizing here, but Dan's material does seem to appeal to a person who's not engaged in scholarship themselves, who's not aware perhaps of how much is beneath the waterline on a lot of these issues. And why I say that is that when I talk to other people who are academically trained, who have interacted with and are engaged in scholarship, when they watch some of Dan's material, they see right through it. They see right through the hand waving and some of the sloppy assertions, because at best they know that the issues that he's presenting are far more complicated than he makes them out to be. And also understanding that at best, Dan is working within a scholarly tradition that has enshrined certain assumptions about the Bible, assumptions that preclude certain conservative interpretations from ever getting a hearing. And so Dan can talk about data over dogma all day long, but the data that is allowed to have a voice is data that's been pretty carefully filtered. There's some pretty significant boundaries put around the type of data that you're allowed to count as data. And in the end, he's just as dogmatic as anybody about the positions that he and his scholarly tradition will embrace or allow as permissible. And so while he says it's data over dogma, it's not surprising that he is essentially just taking pot shots at conservative conclusions all day long, because the goalposts kind of have been set up to allow that. And I may be saying more here than I'm able to explain in this video about some of the ways that critical scholarship works, the Enlightenment assumptions that have been baked into it, but maybe we'll put a pin in that for the future. Dan's material, as a result, is really appealing to people who kind of love this idea that there's this whole secret truth about the Bible that their evangelical pastors have never told them about, and they're really drawn to questioning these conservative assumptions, and are perhaps drawn to his confident and,
all right, let's see it,
even smug demeanor, and a set of conclusions that also happen to align with striking frequency with a particular socio-political standpoint. But again, when you work in scholarship, when you're familiar with the stuff that he's talking about, it's just harder to be impressed. When you get to those did you know moments, I think, well, yeah, I just worked through that passage and those issues in sermon prep last week, and here's 5 really important things that you totally ignored there. And that brings me back to the title of this channel. In conclusion here, we should be reading. There is something cool about the era that we live in, where scholars can have YouTube channels and have long-form discussions, and I'm not denying that no benefit to that. But so many people would be so far better served by actually reading books instead of just taking in video content, reading books from both sides of the debate that concern them. Books, the written word, have so many built-in features that advance knowledge in ways that video content just doesn't. Things like being forced to think things through before you put them to print, having editors and others who can read and ask you to rewrite things until they're more clear or until you actually can stand behind them, being able to show citations, being able to have other people cite you and quote you, being able to see context, all of that and more make the written word and published books such a better medium for ground level engagement with topics that matter in so many ways. And there's an objectivity to it as well that is really important. You don't get wowed by tone of voice or facial expression. It's just words. And it's words that will stand or fall as they make sense with the information, or don't make sense, as it were. And so with that being said, I'm going to sign off for now, because we should probably both be reading.